Despite Locke's systematic dismantling of Hobbes's absolutism and construction of limited government theory, serious problems remain that Locke acknowledges but doesn't fully resolve. These problems would occupy subsequent political philosophy and remain contested today. First, the judging problem. Locke says the people judge when government becomes tyrannical and resistance is justified. But the people isn't a single entity with one mind. People disagree about whether government has violated its trust. In the American Revolution, patriots judged British rule tyrannical. Loyalists disagreed. Both sides cited Locke. Who was right? Locke would say history vindicated the patriots, but this makes right depend on success, which seems unsatisfying as a principle. More fundamentally, if individuals or groups judge for themselves when resistance is justified, haven't we recreated the state of nature's problem, everyone being their own judge? Locke established government precisely to remedy this inconvenience. But when judging government itself, he returns final judgment to the people, each individual deciding whether the threshold for resistance is met. This seems circular. Hobbes would pounce on this problem. Locke's theory recreates the instability it claims to solve. By allowing subjects to judge the sovereign, Locke makes authority conditional and disputable, which invites constant conflict over whether government has exceeded its bounds. Utter tab determine absolute authority, then ambiguous, limited authority that generates perpetual disputes about limits. Locke's response is that the alternative, accepting tyranny because resistance might cause disorder, is worse than occasional misjudgments about when resistance is justified. But this doesn't solve the theoretical problem. Who judges the judges? When people disagree about whether government has betrayed its trust, what tribunal settles the dispute? Second, the consent problem. Locke grounds legitimacy in consent. But what constitutes genuine consent? Express consent is clear but rare. Most people never explicitly agree to be governed. Tacit consent through residence or inheritance and property seems too easy to impute. If merely living somewhere implies consent to be governed, can anyone genuinely withhold consent? This makes consent more fiction than reality.
Moreover, majority rule creates its own consent problems. When the majority makes decisions the minority opposes, is the minority consenting? Locke says they consented to majority rule when joining civil society, so they're bound by majority decisions. But this makes consent to the procedure substitute for consent to particular outcomes, which attenuates the consent principle considerably. Third, the property problem. Locke's emphasis on property as a natural right with special protection creates tensions. If property is so central to political standing, what about those without property? Are they second-class citizens? Locke seems ambiguous, sometimes suggesting property ownership is necessary for full political participation, sometimes suggesting the right to acquire property belongs to everyone equally. Moreover, Locke's labor theory of property, while ingenious, creates problems. How much labor must you mix with nature to establish property? If you fence land but don't cultivate it, is it yours? When you employ others to work your land, whose labor establishes property, yours or theirs? Locke doesn't adequately address these questions, which would become central to later debates about capitalism and socialism. Fourth, the legislative supremacy problem. Locke says the legislature is supreme within government, but still limited by natural law and the purposes of political society. But who judges whether the legislature has exceeded these limits? Locke says the people, but this brings back the judging problem. In practice, legislative supremacy risks becoming legislative absolutism if no institutional mechanism checks legislative power. The later development of judicial review and constitutional courts addresses this problem, but Locke doesn't provide these mechanisms. Fifth, the toleration problem. Locke argues for religious toleration, but excludes atheists and Catholics. This reveals a tension between principled toleration, flowing from natural rights and limited government, and pragmatic toleration, limited by judgments about social stability. If government can exclude those it deems threats to civil peace, toleration becomes contingent rather than principled, and the scope of toleration depends on government's prudential judgments about danger. These problems aren't fatal to Locke's theory, but they show that limited government creates its own dilemmas, even as it solves absolutism's problems. Political philosophy after Locke would spend centuries trying to address these issues, developing clearer theories of consent, working out property's role in political life, creating institutional mechanisms for checking government power, and refining the principles and limits of toleration.